It's an absolute pleasure to have Professor Sam Moyn here for me, and I suspect for many others as well. Sam has a PhD from Berkeley, a JD from Harvard, and has taught at many institutions, Columbia, Harvard, and Yale. I want to note that I was at his job talk at Columbia when I was an undergraduate, and I remember it well and fondly. Now he's the Henry Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law and also a professor of history there. In the last 15 years, Sam Moyn has kind of done the thing, which is that he started as a historian of intellectual history and of public intellectuals, and now he is indisputably a major public intellectual who is central to a number of conversations about human rights, about internationalism, about law, about the presidency, about neoliberalism, and now about war. I don't think I'm alone in having been edified and influenced by his writing. Indeed, if you read the kinds of books and articles that we do, there's a kind of statistical inevitability that you will have been shaped in some way, or at least exposed many times to Sam's writings. He is shockingly prolific. This is, by my count, the book that he's speaking about that will come out later this year is, by my count, the seventh book under his sole authorship that will appear since 2005 when he started publishing books, two of them that year. And the 13th book, if we count his edited volumes and things that were authored with other people, as well as a barrage of articles for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Republic. He also was part of the founding collective for the wonderful journal Humanity. And those of you who are on Twitter will know that Sam is a frequent source of good sense on there and has a massive Twitter following. And usually when you see this kind of intellectual ferment, I think it's easy for us to imagine that what we're looking at is just someone who is, a very quick worker, early riser, and perhaps negligent of their domestic duties. But I want to offer a different theory. I think that with this level of public engagement, usually people who do this in the way that Sam does it aren't just writing a lot. They usually are writing in this way because they have some perspective, sensibility, or temperament that allows them to consistently and productively engage with all kinds of things. And I think that's something that we can see in Sam's corpus, that he has any number of engagements, but they all sort of spring from a set of questions that he's asking and a set of reactions that he tends to have that are quite interesting and usually provide fresh perspective. Usually, consistently in my reading, provide fresh perspectives. So I want to talk a little bit about that, or just talk briefly about that, and then just make one other observation about Sam's work. My sense is that this sort of Sam Moyn sensibility has a lot to do, and Sam, I'll be thrilled to be corrected, but it has a lot to do with a kind of discontent with the pieties of liberalism in the wake of the Cold War. Sam is part of a generation that has, as an intellectual historian, is very attuned to the kind of bold political thought that marked the 19th and earlier parts of the 20th centuries, and has documented and spoken about a kind of depletion of that thought to where we are no longer talking about achieving meaningful equality, but more talking about reducing poverty, not really aiming at a democratic world organized around the participations of citizens, aiming more just to have kind of narrowly construed civil rights or human rights that can be enforced globally, not really seeking peace or expecting that peace will come in our time, just hoping for a kind of less bloody forms of war. The title of Sam's most recent book, Not Enough, I think captures the spirit of a lot of his interventions. It's a perception of the insufficiency of a lot of our conceptual categories and our political thought, and an attempt to sort of widen our sense of what might be possible and ask really probing questions about that. And the thing I want to mention about Sam beyond this is that in asking those questions, he really asks them. I think it is easy for someone with Sam's kind of discontented and sometimes radical perspective to be a polemicist. And that's not something that I see in Sam's work. What I see is someone who works with remarkable precision, nuance, whose thought evolves, who has responded to critics, and who is as likely to end an important sentence with a question mark as he is to end it with an exclamation point. And I think that might be a good point of departure for what I take to be the subject of the talk today, which is asking a big question whether in humanizing war, we've lost something serious. Sam Moyn.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That did get my agenda right, except that it was way over the top in doing so. I'd like to thank Jonathan for the invite and Daniel for taking a break from his well-earned leave to be in discussion. So I'm supposed to talk for 15 minutes or so about the kind of how I got to my forthcoming book, which is entitled Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, coming out in September. And I'll just tell you how I got there and some of the main arguments, and then would love to discuss any and all of the above. So this is a project that came out of my experience of Barack Obama's presidency, watching it, and the sense crystallized not just in myself but in many others that the global war on terror actually expanded in certain ways during that presidency and became enduring in ways that even our new president has said on the campaign trail, and indeed once in office, that he wants to contain. What I see in the Obama presidency and through our time is a changing form of war. And my book is an attempt to think through some of its kind of moral premises. Again, not to make easy or snide kind of conclusions about it, but in a sense to worry about its current form and possible future. So when I refer to this changing form of American war in our time, I really have in mind something that actually began under in the later years of George W. Bush's presidency, even if it crystallized under Obama's reign in his first term. And it's really a move from what you might call heavy footprint warfare to light or no footprint war. And you know what I have in mind. It involves withdrawing troops, especially from places where war has become controversial, including in electoral politics like Afghanistan and Iraq, and turning more and more to special forces, where Obama took their use up to the level of 60 or 65% of all countries in the world by 2016, and Trump even further, as well as to those no footprint weapons of drones, along with standoff missiles, which you probably know, we've probably all read if we've been paying attention, about the incidents of their use between 2009 and 2016, and indeed since. So far as we know, actually, Joe Biden hasn't struck with one in the first few weeks. Now, of course, there have been other trends, and no one can say whether this turn to what I'm going to call provocatively humane war, with its light and no footprint form, is going to be evanescent or enduring. And even during the Obama presidency, we saw lots of carnage in various places that could, in the case of Libya, become quite anarchic, and the turn to the war against ISIL or ISIS involve lots and lots of very bloody disorder. And worst of all, Obama began and Trump continued the proxy war, something familiar to us from Cold War history, in Yemen, which, in one of his first acts, Biden has promised to stop, at least in its offensive dimensions. But this new form of war is, what I'm going to call humane war, is morally interesting, and it could cast the die for a future, not just for this country, but some other powers, for how war is increasingly fought. So I want to take a couple minutes to just define how I see it emerging, what makes it humane, in scare quotes if you insist, and then what the book, which has a much kind of longer timeline and global, I hope, scope, tries to say about this humane war. So what I have in mind is that, as we all know, there was a little bit of anti-war protest after 2001, including, in all fairness, the largest day of anti-war protest of all time. But when Obama came to power in 2009, it was amidst another, I think, in a different moral atmosphere, where there'd been a kind of miasma of inhumanity that offended lots of people, even when war itself didn't necessarily, even the Iraq war in particular. And of course, I have in mind the enormous attention that the turn under Bush to torture got, as well as the construction of the offshore Guantanamo site. And Obama's first act was to promise to make American war humane and to restore the taboos that had been shattered. And it was welcomed that he did so in those first days of his administration. The Washington Post, on the third day, the same day Obama struck first with a drone, had the headline, "Bush's war on terror comes to a sudden end." In the New Yorker magazine, Jane Mayer, who had been an amazing journalist, telling the story before the story of dark money, of the dark side of torture and so forth, wrote, within the first couple of weeks of Obama's term, "Obama consigned to history the worst excesses of the Bush administration's war on terror." So my suggestion is that making war humane and restoring the legal constraint in particular around how war is fought is a good thing, but it also can provide, and did and does, what we could call humane legitimation. And the result could be kind of removing a bug from a program of what has turned out to be endless war. So I don't want to get into great detail about Obama, who, I voted for twice. But, if you look back at his speech making around war, it's actually suffused in a way I think no leader of a great powers rhetoric has ever been, with the rhetoric of humanity and warfare. In May 2019, at the National Archives, in his Nobel Peace Prize address in December of 2009, December 2009 was the Nobel address. And then, of course, he introduced a moral framework governing targeted killings outside areas of active hostilities. This is all administration language that actually touted its humanity and promised to go beyond what domestic and even international law requires in taking care to avoid civilian death. Actually, even Trump retained Obama's policy around drones and special forces, that if there's a risk of even one person dying or suffering injury as a result of a strike, it can't be done. Now, of course, that's not what actually governed operations, but the amazing thing is that the Obama administration imposed that rule on itself, at least as policy, and indeed that Trump kept it. So all of this, made me kind of get interested again in this story of the rise of humanity and warfare as a goal morally, and as a a legal campaign that we, understandably back, and that, most of us support. And so I began to kind of research this, and in the end, what I've tried to do is tell a kind of global history of the attempt to make warfare more humane that ends in the Obama and Trump administrations. And when I look back at the origins, which I would date to Europe and especially Switzerland in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1860s in particular, what you find is that from the first, there was a big debate amongst reformers about how the goals of humanity and peace, humanization of war and pacification would fit together. And actually a lot more intense debate in the 19th century, at least in thinking about war in the racially white world, which is an important qualification, about whether humanizing war could threaten or at least postpone peace. And conversely, whether peace was kind of too ambitious a goal, and instead it could threaten the more proximate ambition of making enduring war humane. So I don't want to get into detail about kind of most of the book, since it really is an attempt to canvas this long debate about the relationship of bringing humanity to war and bringing peace to initially the white world and later the world as a whole. I will say what I harvest from those debates are some predictions of risk, because the funny thing is that for all that advocates of peace worried about the malignant effects that humanizing war might have, it doesn't seem like those risks accrued for a really long time. War was just too brutal, including when fought in transatlantic contest, to make it really credible to think that there could be much risk to peace, to the project of making war humane, especially just by getting states to agree to some limits, whether in what kinds of weapons they used, who was eligible for targeting, and so forth. And yet, the most interesting worries, I think, were voiced in the 19th century. And I do a lot with the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who I think both kind of raised the prospect that advocates could compromise and agree too much with militaries in seeking zones of compromise, and cited the example from earlier history of the attempt to make chattel slavery humane as a good reason why we should avoid those sorts of compromises when it comes to war. And he also raised the risk that audiences could, let's say, reach a kind of bad faith about humane war when they're told that the wars they necessarily have to fight are at least being fought humanely, as Barack Obama did many times. And here Tolstoy used an analogy to the attempt in the 19th century to make non-human animal slaughter more humane, and several times suggested that those who satisfy themselves that they're moral because the food they're eating was brought to them more humanely than not, is a worry that he applied to warfare. And I think with respect to both of these worries, it was just too early. And once after, I think, the 1960s and 70s, with decolonization, with new lawmaking, with new constraints on war that were both drafted, and even as old constraints on war began to be taken more seriously, these risks that come to us from the voice of the past turned out to be, let's say, prophetic of a kind of war that is actually coming about now. Now, let me just close, since I'm probably reaching my time, with a few, let's say, provisos, or in the spirit of Daniel's introduction, question marks. So first, isn't it a mistake, one might ask, to call this new form of war humane, even if you invite, those who hear this offensive phrase to hear scare quotes around the word humane if they want? Isn't humane war a contradiction in terms? And the proper move morally, including as historians of moral views, should be to reject anyone who kind of pretends that humane war could exist. I want to argue that historians have to have some such category in thinking, not just about the desire to bring humane regulation to war, which clearly exists, but also thinking about war itself, because it does seem that this moral impulse, abetted by technological change as a matter not always of ethics, but of optics and public relations, that policymakers have changed war to make it more humane, at least in the sense that they do strive, with military lawyers now involved in targeting, to control who's eligible for death and injury, and indeed, though never to the extent we might want, to reduce harm. And this to me is significant because it fits into Tolstoy's story about compromise between activists and militaries themselves, who, since Vietnam, have taken on the mission, and kind of say so with pride, of making war making more humane, at least in some sense. Now, the most popular view, which I'm also resisting, has been that even if that's true to some extent, we should care most about the way in which claims that war is being fought humanely or more humanely actually masks way too much in persisting inhumanity. And most of the criticism of the developments I have in mind, especially drone warfare, take this form. And I want to acknowledge that it's an incredibly powerful criticism. And the point of identifying the coming of humane war as something real that we have to chart historically, including the involvement of law and lawyers in it, is not to minimize or trivialize harm. It is to kind of get right what that harm is. So on the one hand, it involves war itself, which is, potentially of independent concern compared to how it's fought or what the consequences are for various audiences, including, domestic audiences. But second, I think there are some emergent features of this so-called humane war that are actually taking what had been so, focused on injury and death, and portrayed as such since the time of Homer, in a new direction. And it's really there I want to end. If we just think of humane war as a smokescreen for inhumanity, we miss that in certain of its forms, war is being transformed into a kind of policing. And actually, again, advocates and audiences sometimes urge this to keep going, to go further. And this form of war could be one which reveals that, injury and death are not as central, don't need to be as central to war as they have been historically. And I think we see that in some aspects of drone campaigns, which are as much about surveillance as injury and death, and illustrate that what's at stake is a kind of discipline. as much as or even more than violence. So if I'm right, this form of humane war is disturbing for a different reason or an additional reason than the traditional grounds we might have for caring about war itself or the way it's fought, which is injury and death. So I think I'll leave it there. The book was a tough one to write because it's trying to discern something emergent, and I can't promise, I wouldn't want to, that it will, that history won't go another way, that great power war won't return, indeed, that war will become less brutal rather than more, which is always a possibility. But this evanescent form would still be really interesting because it could come back. It could be something to keep track of as the geopolitics of the next couple of decades begin to unfold.
Okay, Sam, thank you so much. So what we're going to do is Sam and I will speak for a little bit. I'll ask him some questions, but then we will at some point sort of move over more to or entirely to audience questions. So what I would ask is that if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A, and then I'll be able to see them and I can ventriloquize them. And if there are multiple questions on the same area, I can collect them. But whenever you feel moved, put them in the Q&A, and then we will try to get to those. Sam, let me start with one question I have. The story, as I understand it, is that the argument about the danger of humane war is not a new one, but in some ways, the real possibility of something that resembles humane war is new. So we need to look back to Tolstoy and to others to understand our current moment. And the way you describe the newness of the moment, that allows for the possibility of humane war, is through political developments like decolonization, legal developments. And so that's a kind of story about how we organize ourselves and how we think of, we kind of deploy the categories. But I'm wondering how much of this is a technological story. Is this a story that the technologies are what allow for the possibility of quote unquote humane war, and now we really have to have that argument that was always kind of waiting to be had in the 19th century?
No, it's a great question, and clearly that's some substantial part of the truth. I prefer to think of it as a moral choice, but it's clearly one that technology makes credible in new ways. Now, when we look back, actually, there's a part of the book that's about kind of the rise of air war, the failure to control it. Yeah. And, as many in the audience will know, some of the initial enthusiasts for air control, including in this country, but also in the British Empire, think of it as bringing exactly what drones may bring, which is not just increased precision compared to the alternatives, but a kind of surgical precision that they openly advertise as humane and in its spirit. Now, the trouble is that that's not the way air war actually worked, not least because a lot of its advocates also embrace morale bombing in colonial circumstances and then in other ones, and even if they'd wanted to stick consistently to this new form of war, they couldn't because of the nature of the technology. I think that the technology is crucial, and your question is redoubled in force when we consider that drones themselves are kind of primitive in many ways, and we're facing right now the rise of so-called autonomous weapon systems, which have no drivers with joysticks, unlike drones, and which it's thought someday will be able to program to be even better, including in following international so-called humanitarian law. than drones have been. And so you're absolutely right. But in the end, if we wouldn't want to, get a story of technological determinism going, since technology can allow us to, make certain choices more or less credible. My deepest goal in the book is to provide some reminder of the incidence of peace activism at one time. And its absence in our time seems hard to explain, let alone justify, as a matter of the fact that it's technologically possible to have endless humane war now in ways it wasn't before. So I'm totally on board with your point, while wanting to preserve agency for a different moral choices than have been made lately.
And I think the lack of a kind of large and consistent anti-war activist space is interesting, and also I think telling along the lines you imagine, because one of the most persistent and indeed successful global challenges to the United States' military presence has been a set of anti-basing protests that have been ongoing, since World War II, basically, and a lot of those have to do with the materiality of running a war. What it means when you have a lot of service members stationed in a place, and they go off and they get in fights, and there are sexual assaults, and the response of the military has just been to try as much as possible to shrink the footprint. And so, almost to get to the point of the Platonic ideal of war, where there is no, territory involved, it's all happening in the skies. But the result of that is that, or at least the nightmare, as you propose, is that maybe that makes the basis for resistance go away too, and that we're all just kind of shrugging our shoulders and think, well, if there's no immediate incidents of how this war impinges on people's backyards, then it becomes much harder to generate coalitions. Did you feel that, reading into these 19th century debates gave you some sense of how an anti-war coalition might be generated, or what kind of historical conditions might produce that possibility?
I think it's a great question. I mean, it's clear that whether we're thinking of the 19th century wars, or the World War, at least World War I, or the Vietnam War, we can cite a number of factors that must have mattered, that might make you skeptical that something comparable could ever emerge in the face of not just the new form of war I've written about, but the transformations of U.S. empire territorially that you've written about, and which of course are central, with the global basing long before there was global drone basing, that has made American war possible in many of its recent forms. But I guess I would say that there has been some anti-war protest, and I don't mean to refer so much to that one day of street protest around the Iraq War, so much as presidential elections, which to me suggests that, for all the skepticism we might want to mount, and which I share, that the American people, or the global audience for American belligerency, is going to have the conditions soon to exercise control over war. Yet you have two presidents in a row, a very different otherwise, Obama and Trump, who are elected as, let's call them, anti-war candidates of a kind, and both end up endless war candidates, presidents. And it suggests to me that war matters. Now, maybe not the particular wars that you and I are kind of talking about now, but there's something to go on. and we wouldn't want to reach the depressing conclusion that, say, it's only when, sons, brothers, and husbands are dying in massive numbers that we get the kind of massive anti-war politics that characterized the 19th and at least parts of the 20th century.
My colleague Michael Allen has a question that I also share, which is raised by what you just said, which is how to think about the Trump years through this lens. Because, I mean, Trump is sort of famous for saying the quiet part out loud, and one of the ways that he did that in foreign policy was to, take an increasingly sort of deodorized war and put the stink right back on it, and celebrate the violence, even if his actual sort of behavior wasn't
Good.
remarkably different.
Good.
But certainly the meaning behind it was, and a
Good.
lot of what I mean, it's not just Trump, right? It's also his his voting base wanted the cruelty, and wanted to see, the United States as putative enemies kind of suffer and humiliated and terrorized in some way. And I know that some of your colleagues at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft have basically argued that, yeah, actually Trump clarified things. Like there's something useful about that, because Trump showed you what war is really about. And the thing to, in a larger sense, fear is what we are quite likely going to get under Biden, which is a return to the sort of smoothly bureaucratized version of war that is a little harder to sort of, a little more elusive for protesters to respond to.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with the Michael Allen's comment and your expansion of it, but I think I would want to qualify it even so. It's perfectly right to say that compared to Obama's relatively more humane immigration regime, or to Obama's comparatively humane drone war, Trump flaunted cruelty in those areas and others. But what I think is will seem more significant as we kind of try to gain perspective on these things is how much continuity there was. You're perfectly right that there were lots of showy examples of theatrical cruelty, and I'm completely with Michael that some of Trump's most outrageous pardons were of war criminals, and so there's big difference there. But what stands out to me is that, notwithstanding some expansion of what Obama wrought in the drone and special forces war, there's much more continuity, and there's amazing continuity insofar as whether, as a result of, folks pushing back or his own, indifference, Trump did not bring torture back as he promised to do. And he didn't remove at least the rule that as policy Obama had imposed on the drone war, that the drones and special forces work outside areas of active hostilities humanely. That is, that they avoid striking except when they can be sure that no one will be injured or die. So we'd have to look, I think, at the level of how both administrations actually kind of purported to follow those rules, because clearly we know that aside from much less transparency, Trump's people didn't follow those rules or even pretend to as much as the prior administration had actors that insisted that they do. But I would say the fundamentals are very similar, and the fact that Trump couldn't bring back a lot of the brutality, even of the George W. Bush's war, let alone kind of the imperial wars and the race wars of the Pacific Wars and the colonial wars that Americans have fought back centuries, and against native peoples nearby before that is, to me, more suggestive that even Trump proved caught up in the coming of humane war in ways that are, I think, the remarkable thing.
So the familiar anti-war argument is that the humanity is hypocrisy, that it's a lie. And, we talk about the weddings that have been hit by
Of course.
airstrikes and all that kind of thing. And you're not denying none of that. And indeed, that's
Sure.
see yourself as making a critique that goes alongside it, but is distinct. But, if we see a fuller achievement of humane war so that, the drone strikes are indeed surgically precise as they have promised to be, but have never managed to be, uh, then we're left to really have to level a different kind of critique against the United States' wars. And could you make that? I mean, what's the,
Sure.
if war doesn't have any collateral damage, then it just becomes a kind of policing, because the argument for it is that this is really important, because if it's not for the United States maintaining some kind of global order, then there will be global chaos. And there's not to go off about it, but I feel like there's a real parallel between the policing discussions. What is the importance and the necessity of aggressively armed police departments, and what is the necessity and importance of an aggressively armed United States. But the argument is similar, right? Is that either there will be anarchy or there will be China, but the United States has to maintain some kind of force, otherwise bad things will happen. So could you kind of explain
Yeah.
what the argument is without the bloodshed?
Sure. So, I mean, all great things. I mean, I'll just briefly let me introduce a comparison between the responses to My Lai and Abu Ghraib, just because the stink of inhumanity is not new after 2001, and yet it can play very differently relative to the strength of anti-war politics. So, I mean, on my reading, and there's a whole chapter on Vietnam in the book, much of the dissent around Vietnam, especially when international law was invoked after escalation in the mid 60s, was around aggression and around the war itself. And it utterly mattered then when My Lai was revealed in 1969. The war was unpopular. Johnson had decided not to run, and Richard Nixon had promised to end it. And the revelation of atrocity added fuel to the fire of an anti-war politics that had already had a chance under very specific circumstances to become much more humane. And so, mainstream. And so there, the risks I talked about don't seem that pertinent, because on the contrary, in, denouncing atrocity and inhumanity can actually serve peace. But that's just not what happened after 2001. And when in March 2004, Sy Hersh, same reporter, et cetera, helped to reveal Abu Ghraib, the political dynamics ended up being one of re-legitimating an endless war on terror, sort of like the opposite happened. And so I take from that comparison the need to pursue, a politics of making humane war, but never separate from these larger questions about, war itself, the role of the United States in the world, and so forth. So I think we'd just have to have a really long discussion to figure out what that role currently is, especially to the extent it's becoming less and less violent, whether we want it to be policing, whether that's, the ideal. It is staggering to me that compared to the abolitionist perspective of some prior peace activists, and in spite of the rise of abolitionism after, the killing of George Floyd and so forth, at least, the mainstreaming of it, most of the energy when it comes to America's global operations is not abolitionist. It's actually, hoping to bring policing to the world, in at least, in under the humane rules under which police are supposed to operate in. And amazingly, in current legal reform debates, the highest prize is seen to be things like getting warriors to have to capture rather than kill when feasible, which is a policing norm, or even ask for surrender before killing, which the law currently allows in wartime. And I think that's because there's the sense that all we can hope for in an America set to continue global operations indefinitely is to make it more like policing. But then you have this irony that we're critical of policing at home and pursuing it abroad, which to me seems dissonant.
So I think, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that I don't think that everyone in the audience can see this, but Sam and I can. We have a lot of questions, which is wonderful, and we'll try to bunch them and such, and push forward those that immediately relate. But I just want to apologize in advance if we can't get to all of them. But what you just said about policing, I think, brings us to a question that my colleague Doug Keel has raised, which is, what are the domestic payoffs, or can we think reflexively about what it means for the United States to normalize war or promote peace? And he just phrased it this way: in a settler society formed by war and maintained with militarized domestic police forces. So you already noted the tension between how people in the United States think about external war and sort of internal war, but maybe you could speak a little more about that.
Sure, it's a great question, but I'm not sure I have a very kind of original answer. But if we reclaim the moral choices that we are making, and make them differently, we would see an abandonment of, among other things, military spending of the kind that our taxes support, and put it to other ends. I think one of the most offensive things that the government does in this domain is kind of superintend the global arms trade, which is quite apart from any of the wars we're talking about, clean or humane or brutal and dirty. It is about allowing violence throughout the world, perpetrated by others, our clients, our company's clients. So this is something that one would think could be changed as a result of struggle. As Doug Keel notes, I mean, that's hard to imagine in a country that has been involved in racialized violence from the start, and on a global scale for a really long time. I one thing I struggled with in the book is kind of effectively thinking about how that racialization is changing in an era when you have African American generals, Defense Department chiefs, presidents, and indeed some of them, like Lloyd Austin, actually celebrated because their credentials are that they made American war more humane rather than less. So it's somehow intricate to think about the continuities. And once we acknowledge that there are some discontinuities, it's not just kind of Indian war all the way down in scare quotes, that humane war is also a break in certain ways with American traditions of violence, then it should follow, that there's a space opening for other alternative possibilities, even in a very dark American history.
That leads to a cluster of questions that I see here, which is about the military itself. It's so common for us as historians to think of the military as sort of a constant force for violence, and then all of the factors that shape it have to come from Congress or from social protests or other kinds of norms. But of course, the military is a dynamic institution, demographically dynamic in really interesting ways that I think we too rarely acknowledge. my colleague Keith Woodhouse points out that there's also this kind of aversion to studying the military at a lot of major history departments.
Right.
And then Ken Alder asks how much of this story about humane war is a story about things that have happened internally to the military rather than things that have been imposed on the military.
Great. It's a crucial point, and it reflects a whole chapter of the book, which is a study of let's call it the self-humanization of the American military after Vietnam. I think without precedent in really the annals of great power politics, because of course you had in the 19th and early 20th centuries a certain amount of cheap talk in which militaries were involved when things like the Hague conventions around war were negotiated at the turn of the 20th century, or even the celebrated Geneva Conventions in 1949. But after Vietnam, again, not solely or even mainly as a result of military ethics around honor, which haven't worked that well in the past, but around optics, military lawyers assert themselves and gain a really extraordinary amount of institutional control. So in the book, I tell the story of how that emerged in stages, how significant military actors, by no means most in the era of like lost cause narratives after Vietnam, nonetheless got their foot in the door, how after 1989, you have this fascinating convergence where the first Gulf War is the first war monitored for compliance with the laws of war by humanitarian outfits other than the Red Cross, notably Human Rights Watch, while at the same time being the first war in which military lawyers are involved in picking targets. And that's baked in. Now, a skeptical thing to say, and it's right, is that when the military involves itself, it's in order to control the interpretation of what humanity requires. And that's surely true. But that's what, that's what the law of war is about, a kind of deal that states are, and including militaries in them, will accept. And what I think is amazing in historical perspective is the amount of constraint that significant trends in the military have brought to American war. And that shows in, among other things, casualty figures, not just American, which of course are, very small, but amongst our so-called enemies. So I think it's utterly crucial that we not, as historians, open ourselves to the charge, which you still see in the newspaper a lot, that we're not interested in the military because it's really important to study. And I've done my duty in that respect in this book.
Elise Barak has a question that I think is in some ways the really big question, which is that I think a lot of the debates in the 19th century and into the 20th century are about reform versus revolution, right? That, do you want to, as Lenin said, heighten the contradictions until, it becomes so unbearable that you get a clean break and have a civil war and abolish slavery?
Sure.
Or do we want a kind of ameliorative path where the, things that are our greatest pathologies are kind of lessened until they're brought under control? And I mean, this is a classic example of that question. And what you've shown us is that, even the strongest anti-war critics have implicitly been pursuing reform strategy, making war, the kinds of objections they have can be met by just making war more targeted and by reforming war. And so Elise asked sort of, how do we think of that, especially in this current political context, which is palpably shifting toward, on the left and the right, toward people who are impatient with reform as solutions and much more open to contemplating radical ones.
Right. So, I think I would start by suggesting that the rise of more radical, especially younger, folks in the debates and on the streets, which of course is a wonderful thing, should not be presented as taking us beyond reform to revolution. First of all, because that's not in prospect, but also because what's really at stake is what guise reform takes. A more legitimating or kind of more revisionist kind of politics. And it's not, I say that not just because there have been revolutions in the past that, to the best of my knowledge, didn't reduce the incidence of war or its inhumanity, but because it seems as if the for this project at least, we should care about the reformist impulse to make war less brutal, while also making sure that that impulse doesn't legitimate kind of the endurance of war. I do talk a lot in the early part of the book about outright pacifists, or Leo Tolstoy's character Prince Andrew in War and Peace, who says it would be much better for war to be made more brutal so that it would happen less frequently or last less long. I personally reject all of those options. It's not because I don't think we need more radical options, but because the smart thing to say, and I think the morally credible thing to say, is we need to make sure that reform isn't a watchword for unholy compromises, and that fitting, in this case, fitting the call for less brutality, which is reasonable, together with a politics around empire and war itself, because there's no reason to choose between them.
So Chase Madar has another one of those really big questions, this one, the empirical one, which is the story that we are told and that you are telling us is, has at least enough truth that we need to take it seriously, is that there's a declining brutality to war. And the kind of caricatured version of that is humans were relentlessly violent, in sort of prehistoric times, and then have grown less and less so, and now we're kind of at that moment where it's just drones in the sky. But the question is that right? I mean, it could be that the 20th century is actually the peak of violence, and then actually there's been a lot of really violent recent wars, including the Iraq War, and depending on what you mean by recent, certainly a lot since World War II. So is the trend toward more and more humane wars, or are we just getting a blip, or
Right.
how would we know or think that this is the trajectory?
No, it's a great question, and it's I'm not at all on the side of Steven Pinker, and you were nice to say I don't write polemically, but actually I do on occasion, and
That review was polemical, yeah.
And I did write a sort of nasty-ish review. I think still respectful of Steven Pinker's last book. I think the kind of broadest kind of macroscopic claims about the decline of violence are not credible, because they really turn on, as you say, 20th century violence, which leads Pinker to have to regard things like world wars as kind of parentheses, which seems ridiculous, and not to mention the wars of decolonization, which by some metrics were worse, including civilian bombing, the tonnage of bombs, and so forth. I would defend, not against all comers, but at least for the sake of argument, the idea that there are some signs of war becoming less frequent, and the death toll falling. That doesn't mean that there isn't horrendous suffering, including psychic suffering, and that's why I want to make sure that I'm not heard as kind of minimizing or trivializing ongoing violence. But if we don't see moves by humanitarians and military in their kind of common space to argue about not less war, but less brutal war having an effect, then I'm just not sure we can come to grips. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't, it could be a blip. We don't know. And, you know, with the rise of China, though, I'm very worried that Trump brought us both parties into a kind of new Cold War posture. It doesn't go without saying that, you know, as with the world wars, horrendous violence couldn't return. But it seems to me that this blip of humane war is important enough and now long-standing enough, not in, you know, measured by eons as Pinker might, but in decades, to be worth calling out, you know, subjecting to some moral and political scrutiny and so forth. So that's as far as I'd go.
So we have two questions that are about not the form of war, but the content of war. So this is an anonymous question at the top, and then a question a little further down from Norman Joshua. So you haven't talked about the aims of war, right? This is just the means of them, right? But do we see a shift toward wars that at least nominally or rhetorically are more humane in some sense? You know, fighting in Afghanistan to protect women from patriarchy, engaging in counterinsurgencies campaigns that don't just seek to neutralize the opposition, but to win hearts and minds. I mean, a lot of the sort of tactical turns, or I guess more broadly strategic turns within the US military have been about, you know, sort of having tea with people and sort of convincing them to, you know, side with the United States, or at least not violently oppose it. So how does that sort of idea that the point of war is to convince people either on, you know, on your side or on the other side, how does that mesh with the changing tactics of warfare?
These are great questions, and I'll just say a couple of things, you know, that don't purport to, you know, finish the answer. One of those questioners asked in particular about kind of the how we might gender this account, especially in thinking about Afghanistan and, you know, kind of global patriarchy and so forth. I'll just say that the book tries to, in particular, recover the essential role of women activists in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Among other things, there's a whole chapter about, after Queen Victoria's death, I believe the most famous woman in the world, named Bertha von Suttner, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905 and was you know, one of the most significant early peace advocates. You're kind of asking about the kind of end of the story, and I think there's just a lot to say there. So the ends of war have been various, even in American war in recent times, and it's hard to kind of single out one and give it pride of place. We've seen wars that have been humanitarian in rationale. We've seen arguments for different parts of the heavy footprint war in Afghanistan and Iraq that were feminist, or at least a kind of feminist. The kind of war I'm interested in is I would see as a successor to those kind of earlier claims of war, including, you know, Obama's turn to counterinsurgency theory, which is, you know, has a long, you know, imperial history and of history in Vietnam era in the case of US war, and involves kind of hearts and minds and even development. Whereas I can't interpret the, you know, humane war, the special forces and drone war, as anything but about kind of surveillance and control, or, you know, if I can invoke Michel Foucault, discipline. And this is in a way a Foucauldian argument about this part of the war, since it's about the coming of humane control as a mode of war. But that's very different than a hearts and minds war. It's about leaving people living in fear, even when they're not open to violence or they're treated less violently. They know that those means are available. Sometimes they're visible overhead. And so, like, I opened the book with the bombing of weddings that you mentioned, except that, they stopped. And that was a choice. And you wonder if it was a choice that involved emancipating people or, kind of leaving them afraid, and subjugated, for a different reason and in a different way. And so to me, it's about domination. And, war, this form of war allows us to see that war has always been about domination, not killing and violence as ends in themselves. And it, in a sense, it has a virtue that it allows us to see that in ways that even these other recent forms of American war might not.
Um, so you've very helpfully right there contrasted different kinds of domination, right? We usually think of war as something that happens, to an external adversary, and discipline is something that happens to an internal one. And what we're seeing is I agree, a sort of Foucauldian process whereby it all becomes discipline, and you're good at naming that. But we have this question in a different channel in the chat from Nico Letsos. How much does this depend on unipolarity? How much does this depend on the fact that the United States has had, it's not at its apex in terms of economic
Sure.
dominance of the planet, but it has a kind of rough agreement that it will be the policing force. It will be the one with all the advanced weaponry. It will be the one with all the military bases. And so we can sort of imagine this as a policing scenario where it's all inside rather than a war
Sure.
scenario where there's a border and an inside and outside, and that has to be managed.
Sure. Yeah. So no, that's clearly right, and it's a critical part of the context. And I think, that the questioner for, pointing that out. It that does seem evanescent in a way that humane war. It may turn out to not last long, but it at least potentially could last longer than American unipolarity is lasting. And so it's right to think that the norms set now will be fateful, not least because they will apply to others who are getting into the drone game. What you see that most clearly in the autonomous weapons systems debate, because these are not yet modes of war making that really work yet, but militaries are planning around them. And the Americans and the Chinese agree on nothing more fervently together than that this is a form of war that ought not to be regulated in any fundamental way yet, against some of the humanitarians who have become abolitionists on this issue, like the Human Rights Watch funded campaign "Stop the Killer Bots," or "Stop the Killer Robots" or "Slaughter Bots." So this is this is a crucial point, and it's to me the scariest dimension in a certain way, that in a medium to long term sense, this form of war can in a sense transcend the current situation in which it's all under American control, at least in the way that the at least in who is doing the fighting most of the time. Although the Brits are involved in certain campaigns, and the French in sub-Saharan Africa even more clearly, and yet it's still kind of as American allies when we see the return of a multipolar world, the not just war, but this new thing, humane war. We might be sad that we allowed it to come online if there was a chance to stop it.
You've gestured toward Tolstoy and 19th century debates. Ajay Mehrotra asks, what about 20th century debates in World War One. I mean, particularly in U.S. intellectual history, the Bourne-Dewey debate between Randolph Bourne and John Dewey is sort of a chestnut. And is that something you want to talk about, or did that come up in the way you were thinking about any of this?
Yeah, so I definitely try to responsibly cover the debate between advocates of peace and advocates of humanity all the way down to the present, until there's just not a lot of folks on the peace side, and uh, a kind of reform energy coalesces on the humanity side after Vietnam, and especially after 1989. So I won't get into details, but it's a great question. I mean, my general view is that that after World War One, the balance of transatlantic opinion is that there might be a possibility of redeeming the peace agenda, and hence you get lots of peace politics after World War One, and ultimately that leads at least to the legitimation of the United Nations and the United Nations Charter prohibition on force, and the Nuremberg trials privilege of the charge of aggression or aggressive warfare against National Socialist leaders, where humanity doesn't seem like a credible mission anymore. Just because World War One has shown that, quite apart from kind of colonial war, which was never even humane in intention, the rules don't matter in World War One. Now, it's true that after World War Two, even though humane war isn't mentioned in the United Nations Charter as one of the higher aspirations of world order, there are new Geneva Conventions. But there I kind of try to show that in the Korean War, these are still kind of paper promises that are possible, in part because no one, not least militaries, takes them seriously anyway when push comes to shove. And so that's why I kind of focus on the post-Vietnam era, when changing perceptions, changing technology, as you noted right at the start, leads to an embrace of humanity as a real possibility in war, in ways that have really never been possible, even as the peace movements of the past are dying.
I'm sorry. I just want to apologize that I've not been able to get to all questions. It's a sign of engagement that we have so many, and possibly my failure as a moderator that we have not been able to get through them all. But I want to end with one question that I think nicely ties up some of the themes, which is from Neil Shah. It points out that we can talk about the tactics of war, we can talk about the aims of war, but in some ways, what's interesting is it seems like there's a kind of decentralization of who's making the decisions in war, or at least Neil Shah quotes Robert Kaplan in Imperial Grunt saying that, to an extent, soldiers on their own kind of have to implement policy, and the command structure has changed, and there's kind of been I don't know if more decentralized is right, but certainly the informational structures and circuits that govern war have changed, and that we're seeing, perhaps in a sort of very Foucaultian way, that the war has to be sort of embodied and implemented and carried out, in the hearts and minds of the service members who implement it. And is that something you want to talk about?
So, clearly that's got to be right to some extent. But I would argue that, we miss the gift that historical perspective provides if we don't emphasize the reverse. So, Neil's, comment seems to me truest in Vietnam, where individuals, as we know from testimony at the My Lai court martial, were told to be humane and follow the Geneva Conventions in the field, but were also given the sense that it was really up to them whether they did, what it meant. Whereas now there are whole branches, big, corridors at the Pentagon that are there to, among other things, develop metrics And so one rule that emerged in the midst of the war on terror was the so-called non-combatant cutoff value, which again is not intended to be about legal compliance, since the United States doesn't want to kind of get into that in any real way, but as a policy required combatant commanders never to shoot in areas of active hostilities now, which is kind of hot battlefields, if the number of civilians predicted to die went above a certain number. Now, that number differed depending on whether we're talking about Afghanistan or Iraq or the war on ISIS for the time when you had kind of, since that was exempted from kind of that was made an area of active hostilities by the Obama administration. So again, does that leave a lot of latitude, room for maneuver and interpretation and misinterpretation? Absolutely. But compared to what? Before, there was complete freedom to ignore the rules or interpret them whatever way you wanted. And now there's at least some attempt to build an infrastructure. So there's hierarchy in interpretation. Now, outsiders still rightly insist that even the most humane constraint that the military enforces is not good enough. But that's sort of my point, that the debate devolves into one over when American war has become humane enough yet. And amazingly, that's the problem that outsiders as well as insiders at various levels in the policymaking hierarchy have placed front and center. And older constraints, which we might care about in the UN Charter or the Nuremberg, privileging of aggression, are not at all part of the debate, at least in ways I think they ought to be.
Sam, thank you so much for joining us. Because of the webinar format, we can't all erupt in applause. So I will just say this has been an absolute pleasure, and we're really grateful to have had you here.
Thanks for having me. Such a privilege.